Thank you very much. So today, I appreciate that a lot of you will be very familiar with the situation with lead fishing weights in North America and the impacts that they can have on swans and some of the regulations. I'm going to offer you a perspective from Europe, so I'm sure we can learn a lot from each other, and hopefully there'll be some interesting comparisons and contrasts. I'll give a little bit of background to fishing in Europe and also some of the impacts that have been discovered going back decades now to the 1970s. And also I'll give a picture on the current regulations we've got in Europe, but also make some new developments that might take us closer to a lead-free future. I don't know how widely the term angling is used in North America, but sport fishing is essentially what I'm talking about here. I'll try and be careful with my terminology because I appreciate we do have some different terminology. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that lead has historically been a very useful material for people, but unfortunately it is also a deadly poison. The World Health Organization recognizes that there is no safe level of exposure to lead, and that's why across particularly the latter half of the 20th century, gradually we have removed it from things such as paint, as fuel in pipes, but it is still very widely used in some recreational activities, hunting and fishing. I've given a couple of examples here on the screen of its use in fishing. So you can see some ledger weights there on the left-hand side, which are used to anchor baits to the bottom. You've got jigs and lures, which can be used to attract fish, but also one of the crucial ones as far as swans are concerned, particularly are sinkers, or in Europe we call them split shot, which is the name suggests, quite literally a lead shot with a slit drilled in it so that you can clip it onto some line. You can use that to weight down a float. Very commonly used across particularly coarse fishing, not so much game fishing for trout and salmon with a fly, but certainly coarse fishing, which is what we call the sort of fishing for everything else in Europe. So bait fishing, that might be a term used here. And angling is a very popular pastime right across Europe. I mean, there's perhaps something in the region of 20 million freshwater anglers across the whole of Europe. And a lot of the impacts that I'm talking about today are particularly focused on mute swans, largely because there's a very strong spatial and temporal overlap between where mute swans live, which, as in the talks earlier, tend to be lowland areas, lowland rivers, lowland lakes and gravel pits and ponds, which are also the areas where a lot of fishing is occurring. And so that means that it tends to be the mute swans at greatest risk of picking up these lead sinkers and greatest risk of having the impacts of the poisoning. Much less, I think, note about potential impacts of lead angling weights on hooper and Buick swans, which are the other two native species we get in Europe, as we heard earlier. That's not to say that there aren't some localized impacts, but because those two other species are winter visitors that feed primarily in terrestrial habitats where fishing is not occurring, it tends to be the mute swan, the more aquatic of the three, which is also present in the summer, which tends to be bearing the brunt of these impacts. And just to give a little bit of background as to when I'm talking about lead lost during angling, so these sinkers when they fall offline, or things that get snagged and broken off, the amount of lead being lost into the environment by anglers can be really quite substantial. You can see there's a few different studies here which have been done for different types of habitat in different places across Europe. The amounts of lead being lost into the environments can be really quite high at some of these fishing sites. And recently, the European Chemicals Agency, on some work they were doing looking into this, estimated that around 5,000 tons of angling lead is being lost each year just into the EU environments. That's not even the whole of Europe, that's just the 26 EU member states. So some really substantial amounts of lead being lost into the environment. And unfortunately, we know that does end up in swans when they're foraging for grit, picking up these little sinkers, which to a swan just looks like a tempting piece of grit. There's been a lot of autopsy and X-ray based studies which have shown, as you can see there from the X-ray on the left-hand side, see hopefully the shot there in the gizzard. When swans pick these up, they concentrate in the gizzard, swans can't pass them, and even a few shots can cause lethal lead poisoning, or at least some kind of sublethal impacts. We also know from various studies done on the River Thames in the UK that there's a correlation within time and space between when coarse fishing is occurring, particularly during the summer, with when we see the highest blood lead levels in swans. So there've also been some isotopic studies done in certain areas to look at some natural sources of lead in the environment, and that those don't correlate with what we're seeing in swans. So good evidence that where lead is being deposited, it's being picked up by swans and causing poisoning. And the amount of lead in the environment can cause really quite high blood lead levels. So the amount of blood lead in swan's blood before we start to see sublethal, lethal impacts, that level keeps being revised down as we learn more about the impacts that they have. The current thinking is that around 20 micrograms per deciliter is the threshold above which you start to see any some sublethal impacts. In some older studies, you might see that set at 40 or 25, but gradually as we learn more, it's been revised down. I've pulled out here just a selection of studies done from different parts of Europe at different times, showing the mean blood lead concentrations measured in mute swans in places where fishing is known to be occurring. And hopefully what you can take from that central column there is just how high some of these average values be. I mean, some of the levels according to individual swans can get well over 1,000, but these are just the mean values. So what you can see is that, they're consistently above this threshold of 20. And that can lead to some demographic impacts. So again, to go back to the River Thames in the UK, it was studied by Mike Burhead and Chris Perrins, found that in particular, female swans that have strongly elevated blood lead levels, you have very low chances of reproducing. And that when they looked across certain areas of the Thames which had relatively low amounts of lead being deposited versus high amounts of lead being deposited, they found an impact in reproduction, but the impact is quite interesting because when they looked at the numbers of cygnets being hatched by pairs, there wasn't a big difference between the two areas, which suggests that the actual production of eggs and the laying of eggs wasn't the bit that was affected. What was affected actually was the successive fledging those cygnets, so they could hatch them, but because of mortality of the cygnets when they were foraging in this high lead environment, they suffered a much greater mortality, and so the numbers of fledged cygnets was much lower in the high lead area. And mortality certainly is a problem, particularly on the River Thames. That's really was an epicenter of a case of lead poisoning in the late 1970s, early 1980s, that really brought this issue to a forefront in the UK. Because of some localized concerns in the River Thames and other places where angling was occurring and swans were dying, a national assessment was done to try and quantify the problem. And the Nature Conservancy Council produced this report, which estimated that around 4,000 mute swans were dying in Britain each year due to lead poisoning, primarily due to timing rates. And this was at a time when the population was fewer than 19,000 individuals. So it's a huge amount of mortality for not a very large population. And the estimates suggest there was a decline of something in the region of about 15% between the 1960s and the 1980s. That, I think, did prompt an action. I'll talk a little bit more about the regulations later, but just briefly, I think the fact that lead was banned in angling in the UK in 1987 has provided a neat little test of the impact of lead, because it allowed us to compare the situation before and then after the ban. And there's been a couple of studies. So Sears and Hunt found, when they compared the early 1980s to the immediate aftermath of the ban, so the summers of 1987 and 88, an immediate reduction from around 50% of birds that died of lead poisoning to only 30. And then we did some follow-up work a couple of years ago, looking at the more recent time since. Now we're finding only about 6% of swans where the post-mortems have been found to die of lead poisoning. So it's a really substantial reduction. Talk a little bit more about those regulations later, but they do, I think, offer a hint into the population level impacts that lead poisoning from angling weights can have on swans. So I mentioned that it was estimated that by about the early 1980s, that the population declined in Britain by about 15%. After the ban, the population rebounded very strongly, and we always assumed that cause and effects, meaning that it was the ban that it was. But we did some work to try and confirm that a couple of years ago, and those of you who certainly will have heard me talk a little bit about this. We used some time series models to look at this national index of mute swan numbers and what factors best explained this increase, whether it was the change in the status of lead in angling, whether it was banned or not, or whether it was one of the other factors which sometimes are put forward. So winter temperatures, North Atlantic Oscillation of the crop sea. Areas of key crops, in particular winter terrestrial crops, winter wheat, that have been expanding in recent decades, and also water quality as a national index of phosphorus. And when we looked at these models, what we found was overwhelmingly it was the change in lead status, which really explained why the population strongly rebounded. There is some evidence that that line was already starting to go up, and that may reflect the voluntary bans that were starting to be brought in before the regulation. Fishing clubs became aware of the problem, were trying to encourage their members to switch to non-toxic alternatives. But in general, it was still felt by 1987 that the problem was too great, too many swans were dying, and so it was banned. However, regulations across Europe are still quite rare. There's only 2 countries I'm aware of that actually have legal bans on the use of lead sinkers and other lead weights in fishing. So Denmark, since 2002, has had a ban on the import and sale of lead fishing weights. And the UK, as I mentioned, in 1987 introduced a ban that banned the import, sale, and use of lead fishing weights, but only within a certain size range. You can see there, that size range was deemed to be the size range that would most likely be picked up by a swan when it was foraging a bit. There are also 3 other countries there which have some kind of voluntary regulations, but there's no law backing that up. It's just relying on the goodwill, essentially, of individual anglers and their fishing clubs. And often they only apply to certain types of habitats. For example, it's only on certain rivers, not on still waters. And we certainly know, as I said, that the UK regulations were quite effective in bringing down the amount of mortality that was due to lead poisoning. Only 6% now, and that the population size rebounded very strongly once lead had stopped being deposited into the environment. And since about 2002, the population has been relatively stable. We think part of the reason why these regulations were effective is because there was very good compliance among anglers. And that was confirmed by several checks that were done in the years after the ban was brought in. There were some studies where they went out and actually checked on the ground what anglers were using, checked their rigs, checked the tackle they were carrying, and found very low rates of non-compliance with the regulations. But that's still to say the problem hasn't gone away totally. 6% of swans still dying of lead poisoning. Some of that may be due to angling weights, particularly where they're picking up the sizes that fall outside of the ban. So the very small weights or the very large weights. And it could also reflect that some sites, if the birds are able to pick up historically deposited lead, because lead can persist in the environment for a long time. The ban was not so long ago in the grand scheme of things. But without more isotopic studies, we won't know the provenance of the lead that that 6% are picking up. So, in part because of the impact that we know that lead fishing weights can have on swans, and in part because of the success of regulation that's been brought in, there have been efforts now for quite a number of years by organisations such as the African Ocean Water Agreement and the European Commission, who are the sort of the lawmaking body of the European Union, to try to bring in new regulations across Europe to get rid of lead. As I showed you from that previous slide, there's actually not a lot of regulations in those countries. These efforts culminated in 2019 when the European Commission asked the European Chemicals Agency to investigate the use of lead in both fishing and in hunting, and to propose what restrictions might be needed, if any. There was a call for evidence in 2019, and as a result of what's called the REACH process, ECHA made 2 proposals with respect to fishing. They also made proposals with respect to ammunition, and Julia will be talking about those in a little bit. But the proposals for fishing weights were the ban on the sale and use of lead sinkers and lures, and also an immediate ban on any kind of things which are deliberately designed to be lost in the environment. There's been a consultation on that this year, and we're expecting final proposals due in early 2023, and we hope that if these proposals are maintained, that there will be legislation then brought before the European Parliament to try and get this enacted in law. If that is successful, and I suppose it is an if only at this stage, that would mean total loss of lead in fishing across all of those countries. These are the EU member states. So it would mean the elimination of lead fishing weights from quite a large part of Europe. And then if you add to that the legislation we've already got in the UK, that would be a really substantial benefit, I think, to the swans of Europe. Now, Julia will tell you all about the situation with ammunition and how contentious that can be. I think it's fair to say that in angling circles, I think there's a bit more awareness potentially of the impacts of lead shot, possibly because we have had these studies going back to the 70s, which have shown the harm, and because the ban certainly in the UK brought in 1987, there's been a much longer period for people to adjust to the changes. There's a lot of products on the market, tungsten alloys, for example, steel, and also some ceramic products, which have replaced lead that are used and have been used quite effectively. So this quote, I think, from the Angling Trade Association in Britain, I think typifies the reaction, I think, of many, where, as you can see, I think there is an acknowledgement that we need to move away from lead. I hope that will be the post following regulations. To try to sort of summarize, I've tried to whistle through many decades of research, so I've only really skimmed the surface, but hopefully it's given you an idea of some of what we've learned about the impact of lead fishing weights, particularly on mute swans, particularly the UK in recent decades. Despite these impacts, I have to say mute swans in Europe are doing quite well, and certainly in the UK they rebounded very strongly after the regulations were brought in. And on the right-hand side there, you can see the latest range map from the European Breeding Bird Atlas. And the areas in grey are stable range, and the blue areas are expanding range. So the population is expanding south and east and a little bit north. And the figures that you can see there in the table are from one of Eileen's recent papers, which reviewed the populations of the 4 populations who cover different parts of the year. In general, the 10-year trend shows that those populations are stable or increasing. So in general, despite the problems that lead has caused, the current situation is that these swans are doing reasonably well in Europe. And moreover, I think hopefully this evidence shows that where we can bring in these regulations, that they can be really effective at reducing the problems, particularly at the population level. It's a shame in many ways that there's not more regulation across much of Europe, but hopefully with the current REACH proposals that are going through, that could be about to change. But of course, because these proposals put forward for both fishing weights and shooting ammunition, the outcomes of these proposals are tied. So Julie will be talking a bit more about the REACH proposals in her talk in a bit. But for that, I'll just thank you all for listening. I'll leave it there.